Welcome everyone. There's a few people still joining us, but I'm going to get started because we've got an awful lot to pack in this afternoon. We're the Frontline Network, and we exist to support frontline workers, empower frontline workers across the public, statutory and the voluntary sector of the UK. We were formed in 2016, and we work at a local level across the UK with our partner organisations. Facilitating local networks that regularly bring together staff to connect and share experiences, best practice, and to amplify voices to decision makers. We also operate at a national level, and we offer funding, community resources to staff, and that includes the training fund. That's a fund for frontline workers working with people experiencing homelessness, and you can apply for up to £500 for individual training, or up to £1,000 for group training for your organisation. Amanda's going to be dropping some links into the chat so that you can follow up and find out more about any of the resources that are on offer. We also share free sector-wide events on our What's On pages on the website and best practice in our news and views and blogs. So do check out the website for all the latest information. And we have our national conference happening in June, where we're going to bring together speakers from across the UK for a full day of events, all of them free. And finally, we seek to consult with frontline workers, and we run an annual frontline worker survey where you have the opportunity to have your say on a whole range of different issues that affect the sector. And we run that survey every year, and that informs all the work that we do. So today we're really excited to welcome, next slide please, our contributors. We're representing England and Wales today, and we've got James Mullaney from Crisis in Edinburgh, Senior Best Practice Officer, and Sam, who is Landlord and Liaison Officer, also Crisis in Edinburgh. We're then going to be joined by Viki Fox, who is Policy and Partnership Manager for Cyrenians, again in Edinburgh. And then Sarah Walters is the Head of Best Practice from Crisis, and Paul Harris is our Progression Manager from Crisis in Merseyside. So we're going to be hearing from all of them today from different perspectives on working with the private rented sector in supporting people experiencing homelessness. So as I said, there's a lot to pack in. So if we can move to the next slide, please, just a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is interactive, and we really encourage you to ask questions. Please use the chat or quick Q&A function. If you've got something to share about experiences in your own work environment and your local situation, we want to hear about it. And if you've got any questions for any of the speakers, please just post it there, and we'll get to that at the end, and we'll have time to discuss. We're also going to use Mentimeter just to poll you and get your views on a couple of things, and just to get a sense of where people are at today and how confident you feel about working with clients, working with people living in private rented tenancies. So if you could go to the next slide, Rachel, you'll be invited to use Mentimeter. You can access this either on your mobile, if you've got a smartphone, or in a different window on your PC. Just go to mentimeter.com and use the code. You'll be prompted to use the code 39761526. Alternatively, you can use the QR code if you're that way inclined, and you'll be asked a question. It's a poll, it's a multiple choice question. And Rachel, if you could go to the next slide, please. The code is still there at the top of your screen. So we'd just like to ask you how effectively you currently feel that you can support people who are PRS tenants. So do you feel you can support people very effectively, quite effectively? You feel neutral about this subject? You feel that it could be better, or not effectively at all? So that's great. We've got our first answer, and you'll see the chart on the screen will just reflect people's answers. We'll give you a minute there just to navigate your way to menti.com. And as we go through today, do introduce yourself in the chat. It's lovely to find out where people are joining us from. We're a national organisation, so we hope that we'll be seeing people from right across the UK. And let us know any questions that you have for our speakers. Okay, so keep inputting your answers on menti.com using that code. But we're going to move on, and we're going to return to this at the end of the session so that you can see if there's any difference in how you're feeling. So, Rachel, next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to James Mullaney now, who is going to talk to us about the Help to Rent scheme in Edinburgh.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thank you. Hi. Good afternoon. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. As you've already heard, I currently work in the best practice team, but very recently, prior to that, I was working alongside Sam on the Help to Rent project. Rationale behind the Help to Rent project was that in Edinburgh there's a high number of homeless households seeking suitable accommodation. For a variety of reasons, they weren't able to secure council or local authority housing quickly. However, they were also facing barriers and hurdles in accessing the private rented sector. So City of Edinburgh Council and Crisis Skylight had created a service called Help to Rent, which tried to overcome some of those barriers. So I suppose a couple of key things, as you can see on screen, began operations in March 2019. Available to City of Edinburgh Council housing applicants. I'm not going to go into all of the details about the sort of application process, but essentially it was single people, one parent families, couples, people in employment, people not working, all could be referred to the service. We carried out quite an extensive assessment when people applied. Assessment's maybe a bit of a clinical term to use, but essentially what we needed to know was as much about the household or person as possible to enable them to make an informed decision about whether it was going to be a good option for them to try and secure a private rented property. So that would be looking at financial impact, it would be looking at the opportunity cost as well. So what were the alternatives in terms of housing in the area, and what would be the waiting times, and what were the obstacles and things like that. So we really wanted to make sure that it was the best possible option for that particular household or person. Next slide. Thank you. So again, as I say, I'm not going to go through all of this, but some of the areas that, as I say, I worked as a tenancy support officer. Some of the areas that we helped with would be, first of all, finding a place to live. So for some people, they really didn't even know where to begin with that process in terms of understanding how you search for a property, how you work out whether it's going to be affordable or not, understanding whether there was any other money that they were entitled to, so income maximisation, understanding what benefits they may be entitled to that they weren't actually accessing it already, working out whether they needed to, for example, if it's a single person who was maybe under 35, would they be considering moving in with someone else? That could perhaps be somebody that they already know, but not part of their household, or it could be you know, someone else that we would perhaps be able to match them up with. Then I suppose a second strand of the process would be about actually sourcing a property, talking to landlords, going to viewings. I know Sam's going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. I suppose the minimum for each referral that we received was that the person or the household walked out the room better informed about their housing options, any available support options in the area as well, and had a plan going forward, even if it wasn't in the private rented sector. As kind of already mentioned at the beginning, I've recently moved into a new role in terms of homelessness prevention in Scotland. And I suppose with that hat on, I'd also say it's really important from that perspective to identify what factors caused the homelessness in the first place as early as possible, and whether those factors had been addressed and how we could perhaps mitigate some of them going forward. Because obviously if they aren't addressed, then you could potentially be moving someone into the same situation, or I suppose potentially exacerbating their situation, making it worse. So that's part of the reason why it was really important to know the households as well as possible. And again, so that they could make informed choice as well. Everyone was slightly different, but I suppose it was generally around understanding what their needs were, and sort of almost forming a narrative around each person or household to kind of understand. Next slide, actually, might be quite useful. Thank you. I suppose to understand what their needs are, and also I was thinking about it in terms of I've worked previously in like sales roles, and it's almost like selling a product. In this case, the household. I know it's quite a crude analogy, but in the case of the household, you need to know the story and of the product and the benefit to the buyer. So in this case, what we're thinking about, well, if we're contacting letting agents and landlords, and we're suggesting to them that the person that we are assisting to apply for a property is going to be the best possible tenant, we need to know why that is the case, and we need to be able to handle any objections from the landlord or agent. As you can see, we had almost 500 referrals in the first 2.5 years, and around 50% were accepted. As I said before, even the referrals that weren't suitable, and again, it was a collaborative process with the person that was applying to understand why it might not be the most suitable option. And I would like to think for most of the people who didn't go through with the Help to Rent scheme, they still felt that they'd understood the private rented sector better, and maybe understood the overall housing options better as a result. So I think over the 2.5 years, we'd over 100 deposit bonds created. And again, Sam will sort of talk about that a little bit more, but essentially it's over 100 tenancies created using the form of deposit that we'd created for this particular scheme. Next slide. So this is just to give a sort of insight into the kind of information that we sent, because we felt that I suppose communication was really key in terms of everyone who had a role to play in the scheme understanding how it worked and how it could benefit them. I suppose it's quite difficult in terms of, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of framing what homelessness is. There's still a lot of people have a view that it's just single males generally. They think of things like substance abuse, they think of like cardboard boxes, and that's still quite prevalent. And it was maybe about kind of getting a little bit beyond that, although it is part of it. And some people do face that. It was really about saying we've got, you know, a person or a family who had a life event change, or maybe a few life change events, and that's why they're looking to secure a tenancy. And here's why they're a really good fit for your property, and why there may be a better option than there are 5 or 10 people that requested viewings this week. Next slide. And again, this is just additional sort of documentation that we produced for housing officers, for letting agents, and for prospective tenants as well. So I suppose it was about, again, just making sure that everyone in the process understood what the benefits were to them, even the housing officers. Why should you refer someone onto the scheme? Just making them aware of how the scheme worked, how it could benefit them, and making it as easy as possible for them to be able to refer on to us. Again, for letting agents, making it as easy for them as possible to understand how it worked, explaining things like the deposit and how we could support the tenant with the deposit, how we could make sure essentially that they were going to be able to tackle any problems relating to housing cost payments, the ongoing landlord and tenant support that we were able to provide through the service as well. Also kind of promoting things like the good links that we had with local staff at the Job Centre Plus, to ensure that if there was any benefit issues that we could get them resolved quickly, and also links for like housing officers as well, to ensure any housing benefit issues could be tackled promptly too. Also, just in terms of another booklet for tenants themselves to talk about things like affordability, so that you could understand what affordable would look like for them. Also, even just things like understanding the viewing process, and perhaps things that aren't maybe useful to say at a viewing process. I suppose, for example, one of the most common ones was people would maybe turn up at a viewing and say, do you take DSS? And although it's a legitimate question to ask, it's maybe about just framing it a little bit differently to enhance their chances of getting that property. Again, even things like communicating how a tenancy had broken down in the past and what had changed. Just to make that process easier for someone who has perhaps maybe not had to navigate it before, and give them the best possible chance of being able to secure a property in the private rented sector. We also wanted to make sure that tenants knew what they were getting themselves into, who they needed to contact if they needed help. We would also support them with everything from bill setup, getting furniture, dealing with removals from, for example, if they're in temporary accommodation and moving into private let, support to tackle historic debt issues, income maximisation, applying for disability benefits, even things like signposting if they had legal issues relating to maybe marital breakdown or children that they were looking to get back in contact with, employment help, just all of the sort of things that could make that journey, that whole process a bit easier for them. Next slide. Thank you very much. And again, one of the things that this is just basically a checklist, and it was just to emphasise that we really try to treat everyone not in the same way, but kind of using the same sort of process, not making value judgments. The most important thing was, can they afford the property? Is there a better housing option available? Who can we help with this service? Who can we not? And if we looked at risk, it was always in the context of a risk of being unable to sustain housing. So people might gamble, they might take drugs, they might drink, but that doesn't mean that they can't sustain a tenancy. So we did still need to consider the financial impact of those type of activities. And in some cases, it was obvious that the private rented sector wasn't suitable as a result, but it was more about the financial impact rather than the actual making any sort of value judgment. Next slide. Oh, I think there's been a few missed out. I'll just very quickly, just before I pass over to Sam, if that's okay, Sam. Yeah, just in terms of some of the people that we've helped, we had received applications from people who had fled domestic abuse. In many cases, people getting out of that situation don't want to remain in their previous property, but neither do they want to be in a refuge or temporary accommodation for any longer than they need to be. They would rather just get a new place and move on with their life. And so I suppose in some cases, landlords maybe responded more sympathetically in those situations as well. So that was perhaps, in some cases, we were able to support people quite quickly there. We also, as I say, members with previous addiction issues who wanted to rebuild their life, maybe wanted to get closer to family, to rebuild relationships with their grandchildren, sisters, daughters, things like this. Single people have gone up, and once we've moved people into properties, we've then been able to support them through, we've got work and learning coaches, and we've got clinical psychologists now, which is obviously really, really great service that we've got in crisis and not everyone has. But that was able to support us to help people to move into employment and even self-employment as well. We've had people now that have paid their deposit back and moved on from the service and got their own place. We've helped large families who've fled war in the Middle East, who'd exhausted statutory help. And again, we've seen them move into employment, seen our kids settle in school. And I suppose the one thing that most have had in common is that it's quite specific reasons for the decision to get a private let, whether it be family, employment, community, friends, but it was always an informed choice that they made based on things like income, welfare benefit system, likely changes and the availability of other options. The only other thing I'd just say very briefly is I suppose the project also kind of challenged more assumptions. People in receipt of long-term benefits in many cases, because there wasn't as much change in their circumstances. Once you had a plan in place in terms of rental payments and made sure that they had secured their benefits, it was slightly easier to manage going forward. Some of the trickier ones were those who were in fluctuating employment or who, you know, had fluctuation in child benefits payments and things like that, or in some cases people who had full-time employment who were generally more reluctant to want or to access direct help to arrange finances and budget. So I suppose the important thing I took from that was that every case is unique, and just because one person with a set of circumstances, it may be suitable for them, it may not be suitable for someone who looks perhaps on paper to be the same, and vice versa. So on that note, I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Sam. He still works in the Help to Rent project, and he's going to talk about the Landlord Liaison role specifically, and just some of the things that were done to improve communication with and confidence in the private sector amongst landlords and agents. Thanks.
So thanks very much for that, James. So yeah, I'm based in Edinburgh with Crisis in the Edinburgh skyline, and the purpose of the project is a recognition of the growth of the private sector in the housing market, and really what we're seeking to do is to remove barriers to people obtaining private rented tenancies. So, you know, that's why the bond is offered. So, you know, there's a recognition there that people will have difficulty in saving up, you know, the cash deposit. You know, often that can be, you know, in excess of £1,000. You know, the rent average is increasing in Edinburgh. It's a very competitive market. So with that principle in mind of removing barriers and helping people to obtain the tenancies, I've found my background as a housing officer to be very useful. You know, I've been a landlord myself for over 10 years prior to this role. And when I'm when I'm seeking to sell the service to landlords, I'm always very respectful and mindful of their own business needs, and to sell the service on that basis. So, you know, I act as an advocate for the landlords, between the landlord and the tenant, and you know, between Crisis and the local authority. So just helping to smooth things over. So really, what we have to offer to landlords is we offer applicants whom we've assessed in great detail, and we have that reassurance of ongoing support. So and this has a role in helping with arrears, rent management. So, you know, any issues that arise, whether it's someone's benefits suspended or a change of circumstance or change in hours at work, we have staff there to help to smooth these things over. And people forget, I mean, as a landlord, as a former landlord, I'm aware that often you're very time pressured as a landlord, and also in the private rented sector, the monthly rent charges are higher. So that means you have to be very on the ball to manage your rent accounts. So any help you often find that any help is very welcome, and even to the level of just helping to make contact with tenants is no small matter. And tenants are often happier, more comfortable contacting ourselves in the first instance than speaking to their landlords. So that's a big thing to help smooth things over. And also, because I've got that sort of more friendly relationship with the tenant, I'm able to act as an advocate for the landlord on many occasions, you know, helping to put their case and to explain things. So you're like a useful middleman there. And the other thing is that landlords, people often forget as well, landlords are a very diverse group themselves. So sometimes I feel a bit like an empty homes officer at times. You know, quite often I've helped to persuade landlords or homeowners to sign up to the scheme. So some of the marketing materials that James showed there had a role in this, just clearly explaining the scheme to landlords, and also just drawing on our experience in housing regulation and the system to provide landlords with a lot of support as well. So that's helping them to make sure that they're using the correct model tenancy agreement, that they're meeting all the regulatory requirements, you know, energy performance certificates, landlord registration, gas and electric certificates. You know, often there's a learning curve for landlords. This can even apply to large organisations. I mean, there was a very big organisation recently that had a major restructure, and there was very mixed knowledge among the team. And you know, because we developed these, you know, proactive outreach, positive relationship with landlords, we were able to help them to sort of manage their accounts, you know, help them to keep track of rent arrears, because obviously we don't want the tenants to build up high rent arrears. So that even at times we have quite a significant role in rent management. And yeah, I would say that qualitative aspect, just the relationship building, is really the key thing, and has really helped us to develop these reciprocal relationships. So Edinburgh is a really challenging relationship. Edinburgh is a really challenging market. You know, it's overtaken London now in terms of just how busy and competitive the market is, and it's genuinely very difficult to obtain tenancies. There's always a lot of competition, but something that I'm really pleased of is increasingly many landlords will approach us and say, you know, I have an upcoming property that's going to be void. You know, I need you to help. Can you help me find a tenant? So so that's a great advantage for our applicants, that they can get this sort of heads up for properties and get the chance to apply for things very quickly. And obviously that's a great service for the landlord too, because you know they get that reassurance of keeping their void rent loss low and helping to get a good applicant whom we're familiar with. And obviously this greatly helps the local authority to reduce their homeless burden. So really that qualitative aspect of being that kind of customer service aspect of being the first point of contact for these busy landlords, someone that they know well, you know, that helps. And also if a tenant has had issues or there's been some problematic issues, you know, we can also represent the landlord in helping to address those things. And also the last thing I would say really is with regards to the bond. I mean, I spend quite a bit of time explaining the bond to landlords, which I understand because it's quite an innovative scheme. So we've prepared a lot of marketing materials to explain the bond, and sometimes I also kind of act as a kind of fair arbiter as well, because on occasion landlords will seek to claim on the bond. So just as they would claim on a deposit if there'd been some damage or some issues in the property, we have an advantage over other deposit schemes, comparable sort of deposit schemes, because we process things very quickly. We aim to process claims, within a week if we can. Usually the delays are on the landlord side if we have to ask them for like further evidence. So that would be like if they claim a wall's damage, a photo of the wall or whatever is relevant to what they're claiming for. So and we do that in a transparent basis, and communicate to the landlord what evidence we need and the reasons that we're making the decision, whether we're going to fully pay out the value of the bond or just partially. And also we would liaise with the landlord as well, just to verify and discuss what's being claimed for. So it's just a useful middleman to smooth things over and to help them sustain and obtain those tenancies. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James, and Sam, thank you very much. Great to hear from you both, and there's some really interesting stuff to think about there. If anyone's got any questions, do please drop them into the Q&A or the chat. I can see we've got a few coming in. We're going to hand over now to Viki Fox, who was the manager of the private rented sector pilot scheme that was running in Edinburgh. It started in 2020, and Cyrenians and Crisis working together. And yeah, we're going to hear something more from Viki. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Sam and James. So yeah, I work for Cyrenians based in Edinburgh, and I was the PRS service manager, but now manage separate services after the pilot was run down. It was a really exciting project for me to be involved in after experiencing homelessness myself on several occasions, and having lived in temporary accommodation and social and private rented accommodation. So it was something I was really passionate about and was really pleased to be involved in. So I'm here today to talk about the private rented sector pilot, which began life as the hotel to PRS service, but we later renamed that due to extending out our referral pathways to other forms of temporary accommodation. Next slide, please. So the pilot began in July 2020, although it had been several months in the planning, and we initially started off as a partnership between 3 organisations that were local to Edinburgh. It was born out of a need to move people on from hotel accommodation during the pandemic and look at innovative ways to find sustainable permanent accommodation housing options that reduce the lengthy period people spend in temporary housing. Next slide, please. So this happened at a time when there was an unfreezing of the local housing allowance rates, and that made more properties affordable in Edinburgh than we had seen for years. So for a 1-bed property in 2019 to 2020 financial year, the LHA rate in Edinburgh was £551, and this increased to £688 the next financial year, so the beginning of the 2020-21 financial year. Next slide, please. At the same time as the unfreezing of the LHA rates, there was an increase in PRS properties available more generally. This is potentially explainable in part to the short-term let market crashing at the start of the pandemic. So for example, here you'll see that in March 2020, we had 6 studios or 1-beds available within LHA rate. And by June 2020, this had increased to 207. And for 2-beds, this had increased from 6 to 231. So quite a big difference in just a few months. Although I should point out, we've now seen a decrease to these numbers to the same sort of levels as pre-pandemic. And in November last year, we were back to only 15 studios or 1 beds available within LHA. So this sort of showed that unfreezing and restoring LHA to the 30th percentile only temporarily improved things for applicants. And with the LHA not continuing to rise, then properties have become unaffordable again. It shows affordability is driven by the open market, and with landlords sort of selling up during the pandemic, and potentially some tenants have been staying longer, so that's really driven the prices back up. Next slide, please. So the strategy for the PRS pilot, our aims and objectives, the overarching aim was obviously to allow homelessness to be ended far quicker for individuals. In Edinburgh, people often wait more than 2 years for permanent social housing. Another big factor was we wanted to prove the concept that those with higher support needs and who are experiencing homelessness could access the PRS and successfully maintain a tenancy if the necessary financial barriers were removed. So we were able to provide the first month's rent in advance, and then we used a bond, so in the same sort of way as Help to Rent, to replace the deposit, and then tenants agreed to pay back the bond over a 2-year period after moving into the tenancy. We were funded by the Scottish Government, and they were really keen to learn about refining these pathways and opening up the PRS to people who'd been experiencing homelessness and who maybe were on benefits and had poor sort of tenancy histories. And so they want to use our learning points for future service planning and housing delivery. The scheme ended in September of last year, but we continue to promote and share the learning that we gained during this period. The partnership, so this was initially made up of Crisis, Cyrenians and Streetwork, and each partner brought specialisms to the table. So as you've already heard from James and Sam, Crisis had already been working in the PRS through Help to Rent. And through this work, they'd built really good relationships with landlords and letting agents, which was really key to the success of the pilot. Cyrenians provided the coordination, administrative support and overseen the budget, and Streetwork provided support services to people both before and after they gained their tenancies. But they stepped back in the beginning of last year, and it left Cyrenians and Crisis as part of the partnership alone. As I mentioned already, we expanded our hotel criteria to temporary accommodation and other forms of homelessness, such as sofa surfing, ending the time that people would spend in temporary accommodation a lot quicker. And some of the benefits, as well as the human cost to living in limbo in temporary accommodation, where people often experience a decline in mental health along as other support needs, as I'm sure you'll all be too familiar with. There was also significant reductions in costs to the local authorities. So if you weigh up, X amount of years spent in hostel or temporary accommodation provision versus giving somebody £700 for a month's rent in advance, it works out a lot cheaper for the public purse. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So these were our stages. So we had referrals in from a variety of sources. They were from the third sector, local authorities, other housing providers and internal organisations. We even had some people referring directly into us. This was different from Help to Rent, who received referrals via the local authority homeless prevention service. We did a full financial and support needs assessment, and we aimed to cater for people with medium high support needs to be able to show that with the right support in place, anybody is able to access and sustain a tenancy in the PRS. The matching stage, so this could take some time due to individual preferences, and that was one of the benefits of having people having choice and control over where they chose to live. So unlike social housing, where people often only get one choice and they have to move in, it's a kind of take it or leave it thing. The PRS was good for people in that they were able to view as many properties as they wanted and turn them down. I mean, we had people turning down properties because for reasons like they just didn't vibe with it, you know, which wouldn't sort of stand up with local authority housing. And our tenancy support was both pre and post move-in. Thank you. Next slide. So we found several barriers to people accessing the PRS. Despite PRS property availability being at a higher level than previous years, we were still competing against other renters in the market, some of who were working, had good tenancy histories and no support needs. In short, they were seen as lower risk than the people that we were working with. But we did find that our dedicated landlord liaison officer assisted in this hugely, being able to negotiate poor credit scores and people being disregarded due to poor tenancy histories. And they were really able to advocate on behalf of potential tenants. Benefits were a huge barrier, particularly when considerable deductions were in place. We did, as I say, do full financial assessments, and in some cases we found that people couldn't actually afford to live anywhere once their bills and everything had been taken off their income. One person had said that they would rely on food banks to get by, and I know that someone had asked about assessments not being accepted in the chat. So this was a key issue for us progressing applications, was that people simply couldn't afford to live in the PRS or indeed anywhere. So unfortunately, we had to look for alternative options and sort of income maximisation for many people. But I've got a bit more about reasons for applicants not progressing in the next slide. The affordability issue became worse towards the end of the pilot when the universal credit uplift was removed and the energy price rise and cost of living increases were on the horizon. We also really struggled with those with no recourse to public funds who weren't in employment and those who are under 35 with no exemptions. Support provision was also a bit of a barrier, particularly when specialist support was needed, such as mental health, as we find this was really difficult to procure, particularly during the pandemic. And this was because of this, the PRS team found that they were supporting people for a much longer period after they moved in than we'd originally anticipated. And in some cases, unfortunately, we couldn't take people forward on the pilot as we weren't confident that we would be able to meet their support needs after they'd moved in. Next slide, please. Gosh, I'm sorry, I'm talking so much, my voice is running out. I'll try and be quick before it goes completely. So these were some of the other reasons for referrals not progressing, but as James sort of said, every case was individual, so we did very much take it on a case-by-case basis, but these were some of the main reasons. So people decided that the PRS wasn't for them, so after we kind of went through all their housing options with them, they decided that it wasn't for them, and it isn't for everyone, and we were really careful to explain to people the pros and cons of PRS tenancies, such as losing their silver status or the homelessness status in Scotland. However, the work that we completed speaking to people experiencing homelessness in the sector has shown that housing tenure is only one consideration when people are choosing somewhere to live, and for many, location and the ability to view and reject properties, as I said, was a huge positive. There were several applicants who we lost contact with during the process, and some applicants, social housing was offered to them before they viewed and accepted a PRS tenancy. And for some, they had very specific and narrow areas where they wanted to be housed. For example, we had one potential tenant who only wanted to live on a specific street in Edinburgh, which already had very few residential properties due to high guest house use in the area. Next slide, please. So these were our outcomes, our sort of top line outcomes. And so during the time we were working on the pilot, we received 137 referrals. These were from a variety of sources, as I say, such as support agencies, NHS, mental health services, domestic abuse agencies, councils and job centres. We completed 88 assessments and 25 tenancies were started, as well as one move on. So somebody that had moved in and then decided that they didn't like the area, and then we facilitated a move on. That was a total of 27 adults we rehoused and 8 children, as well as 3 dogs and 3 cats. And most of these were in Edinburgh city centre area, but some were on the outskirts, so in Midlothian. We also had 51 viewings. Several of these were virtual, although the vast majority were in person, and we pushed for in-person viewings where we could. 3 tenancies sadly ended. So one tenancy ended after the tenant died. One tenancy ended via abandonment proceedings, and one tenancy ended when the tenant went overseas. Unfortunately, we've had another death following the end of the pilot as well. Next slide, please. So these were our key successes when we reported to the Scottish Government in August last year. These include a rapid pathway to rehousing. We had a 60-day average, although some were much shorter than this. So in one instance, we had somebody that was referred to us and moved into the tenancy within 10 days. But others were a lot longer for reasons such as I've already spoke about, the sort of specificity of locations where people wanted to be housed. We had 5 letting agents and 1 private landlord involved with the pilot, although there were many more that indicated that they would be willing to work with us. And an excellent tenancy sustainment rate of 88%, a really low level of concerns or complaints, and no legal action taken by landlords and letting agents. We also had a high level of tenant satisfaction, choice, control and quality, which we gathered during tenant satisfaction surveys. And I've got a few quotes from them on the next slide. I'll just give you a second to have a wee read of that. And these were quite sort of typical comments from the survey. They've not sort of been cherry picked out of the bad ones. And the next slide, please. Thank you. The next slide. And these were our key learning points. So relationships were hugely important, a variety of different relationships. So the relationships between support workers and tenants, relationships between partners and partner organisations, but also the landlord and letting agent relationships were hugely important, as well as having that key point of contact for landlords and letting agents and tenants, so that landlords and letting agents always knew where they could contact if there was an issue. Communication about the service was really important, as well as communication when things weren't going correctly. This included regular communication with those who we worked with on the pilot, from assessment stage right through to and beyond moving into their tenancies. Information sharing. We did a lot of work on data sharing agreements as information was regularly shared between the partners. PRS is a good choice for some. So there's an assumption often made within homelessness services that everyone who's homeless wants and will only accept social housing, but we found that this was in many cases incorrect. And in fact, people with limited housing options still really value and exercise choice. In Edinburgh, some people referred to the pilot would still prefer social housing, but don't want to wait, and others aren't that focused about tenure type. The pilot enabled people to explore the different options and make their own choices. And some, as I'd already said, chose against the PRS ultimately, but still had a good awareness of what their rights were. So still really appreciated the assistance of the pilot. And locality really was key when people are choosing to live. Affordability is a key component to the PRS pathway, but it's still not well understood. And how affordability compares between the PRS and social housing is really complex. So a lot more work needs to be done on this to really explain and unpack that. And the Scottish Government are doing some work around affordability in housing at the moment. We found that after assessment, many people couldn't afford to live anywhere, as I've already kind of gone into, due to things such as DWP deductions. And we've also found that providing the month's rental in advance had a huge impact and actually took away a lot, like accounted for a lot of the costs, and a lot of the money that we were spending were on advance rental. So it would have been good to have some way within the DWP systems to be able to fund that through people's housing costs within universal credit or housing benefit. We also found that bond schemes can be successful even in competitive markets such as Edinburgh, but also after the 2 years, not all tenants will be able to save to replace that deposit. So to give you an idea of the 22 tenancies we still have running on the pilot, only one has cleared their deposit to date, although there aren't many that are you know, a lot haven't been, the tenancies haven't been running for that long, so that isn't that surprising. The total bonds of the 22 tenancies are 15,500. So we've got about nearly 2,000 that have been paid by the tenants. So our current liabilities between the two partnerships, Cyrenians and Crisis, is sitting at 13,500 at the moment. Although we do have a really low level of bond claims and only had 2 during the project, and one of those was for a really small amount. Next slide, please. So in summary, there's evidence to show that the PRS can be successful and accessible for those moving away from homelessness, even those who might have multiple support needs, but the right support needs to be in place in order to make this happen. And we'd really like to see more landlords and letting agents being recruited and brought on board to PRS access schemes such as the pilot and Help to Rent. And we'd really like to see more services, third sector, housing associations and local authorities and other frontline services being confident in working with the PRS so it becomes a more viable option for people that choose to live within it. Thank you. I don't have a nice thank you slide, but thank you for listening anyway. And I'll pass you over to Sarah.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks for that. And thanks, Sam and James as well. And really interesting to hear what's happening in Scotland. So I'm Sarah Walters. I'm Head of Best Practice at Crisis. And I'm here with Paul, who is one of the progression managers at the Skylight in Merseyside. The best practice team here at Crisis works in England, Wales and Scotland, and we look to identify, test and promote ways of ending homelessness across a variety of things. We also try and have a look at what's happening outside of those nations, perhaps in Europe and further afield, to see what can really help us. Next slide, please, Rachel. Thank you. So I thought what I would do is just really briefly, because I know we've had a lot of things to think about today already, just set the scene a little bit around the PRS before Paul talks about what's happening specifically in Merseyside. The Crisis issue monitors in England, Wales and Scotland, which look at the state of homelessness across those nations. And the recent English monitor shows some core homelessness trends. So just so you can see why we're basically not going to be out of a job very shortly. We can see that the core homelessness has been running at about 200,000 people for sort of the last 8 years or so, with a high proportion of those being sofa surfing. We can see also that that piece of research also showed that the biggest cause of presentations under the Homeless Reduction Act for local authorities under prevention was leaving the PRS. Under the relief duty, it's still relationship breakdown is the major cause of homelessness. We have the next slide, please. Thank you. So these temporary accommodation stats also from the Monitor are fairly scary, and you can see even before the pandemic, which has skewed the numbers in temporary accommodation quite a bit, the trajectory was still on the incline. Obviously the pandemic was an unusual event. We hope that changed some of that. Local authority respondents to the English Monitor were already saying that access to the private rented sector was becoming more and more difficult. And they said actually access to social renting was also very tricky. But we can see that we are going to need to continue to have good options to settle people who are experiencing homelessness in decent, affordable, good accommodation. And these numbers in temporary accommodation just indicate some of the barrier, or not the barrier, so much of the scale of things that we're going to need to address. And also just the amount of money that is spent by local authorities on temporary accommodation alone. You can see £1.4 billion was spent by local authorities to keep people in temporary accommodation in 2021. Pandemic aside, that's a huge amount of money to be spending on accommodation that isn't stable and sustainable, which is why the PRS becomes even more important. So next slide, please. Thank you. So we've got just something from the English Housing Survey, which sort of shows us how many people in England live in the private rented sector already. So these won't all be people who've been experiencing homelessness. We've already got 20% of households live in the private rented sector, although we know that some of those are going to struggle with affording to live in that type of accommodation. Can you give me the next slide? Thank you. Viki has talked about some of the barriers already, and I am guessing that with an audience of people who work frontline, trying to help people find accommodation, these are absolutely nothing new to you. So I'm not going to go over what Viki said, but I guess just to say, if we take a sort of more top line approach to it, that a rental market where you have considerable demand for low-cost housing, which is really outstripping supply, then because housing is a market in the UK, housing markets work like any market works, and it's really difficult to access the support and the housing that is needed. I was hearing even today that in Oxford, for example, there's 40% less accommodation available in the PRS than there was this time last year, and I would suspect that that's reflected across a lot of the areas in which you work. Not all of that will be down to the actual supply of housing. Some of it's to do with slow wage growth, the erosion of sort of social housing stock through right to buy, and other factors around low cost credit. But in the UK, the rental market is a market, and that market is working really effectively, but it doesn't help those people who do really need it. In addition to that, we've got barriers around poor housing conditions. I'm sure you've experienced the dilemma between putting somebody in a PRS property and have them housed, and that PRS property quality being really low. And how do you balance those two factors together? And property conditions, I know, is a big challenge. Plus the discrimination by landlords, where landlords can pick and choose who they have if there's plentiful supply of applicants. Discrimination, even though there's legislation to help us, does cause a barrier. I think James or Sam might have mentioned there's an exit from the market, I think, by some private landlords, where you've got an increase in regulation, and again, so you're balancing. You have that whole balancing act between increased regulation in the private rented sector to correct some of the imbalances, but then also that causing some landlords then to leave, especially where property prices are advantageous to that, and they can realise that capital gain that they've got in their property without having to cope with all the legislation that is going on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to make the point, I suppose, really, that the challenges that we're facing in the UK around access to good PRS is not restricted to us. We're not the only country or countries that are facing this. In the States, They don't have housing benefit as such. They have something called Section 8, which is a way of paying the state subsidising people's rent. And again, the same challenges that we have here around landlords not being very keen to take people on housing benefit applies in that system as well, where landlords can see the increase in income which they can get from inflated rents not being able to be realised by people who are in receipt of those Section 8 vouchers, along with the discrimination angle. That this quote in the sort of yellow box is from a sort of below the line comment, which I'm sure is not exclusively being made by American landlords, but does indicate that link between people who need some sort of rental subsidy and the problems that are perceived by having people who are on benefits being accommodated. The top slide with the rent burden, that is from the IMF, so that is just showing us that across Europe, actually, the number of people who are paying increasing amounts of their rent towards of their wages towards their rent is all across Europe. And this is making the point that this is not just an issue, and affordability is not just something we're looking at in the UK. And I couldn't really let it go without having a picture of Fergus Wilson, who, as somebody said, gives PRS, even PRS landlords think he gives them a bad name. This is the recent landlord who was taken to court over some of his discriminatory practices, shall we say, around allocating properties to people and was taken to court successfully by the Human Rights Commission on that. Next slide is Paul. So I've sort of set a little bit of the scene for Paul to talk about what's happening in Merseyside. And I hope that's helpful. I'm going to pass over to you now, Paul, to talk about what you're doing to address some of those challenges.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Of course, we're obviously all discussing private rented sector and all of our different kind of areas around that. So there will be a number of overlaps from what's been discussed previously, kind of what I cover. But there are a number of things as well in Merseyside that we are doing that's maybe slightly different, or that's obviously exclusive to this local area. So just wants to talk about the Crisis Merseyside offer, what kind of relationships that we are building up with landlords, what kind of practical things we're putting in place to try and build some of those relationships, and also some levels of the support that we give to our members or clients and who are looking to access the private rented sector, and kind of what we do once we help them access that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? It has been mentioned a couple of times before of different types of barriers, but one of those, certainly in Merseyside, is a lack of access to social housing, and there's not a huge amount of housing stock. It's not as bad in Liverpool as it is in other areas. I'm sure different areas across the country have their own different pressures. However, certainly a lack of access to one-bedroom properties does make it an issue in Merseyside. And also the priority banding model that we have in Merseyside to access housing makes that a real challenge. In Merseyside, we have a system called Property Pool Plus, which is social housing. It's essentially a bidding platform where social housing providers can put on their stock, and people who are prospective tenants who are interested in those properties are assessed and given a priority banding for what level of need they are in. And every Tuesday morning, everyone goes on and tries to bid on a property, and it's quite an arduous process for people to get access, and it's also very, very difficult unless you're in the highest priority bands. You could be waiting an incredible amount of time. So for some people, the only real viable housing option is to look at accessing the private rented sector. And Property Pool does have some other exclusions as well. So, for example, people who have just left prison have a 12-month suspension for accessing Property Pool, dependent on their conviction. So sometimes there is no access to social housing for that reason. Now, if we take a prison leaver, for example, they may be leaving prison, and to access the private rented sector, they may need quite a significant amount of upfront costs for doing that, which in a lot of cases is unaffordable, having rent in advance or deposits. Or if they do have some of that cash available, then also the initial tenancy startup costs as well. So things like the cost of furniture, decorating, making a house a home, all add up and sometimes make that incredibly unaffordable and therefore inaccessible. We often have it as well that there seems to be quite a market for the private rented sector landlords to say that they require a guarantor for people to get access, and a number certainly of our clients that we work with don't have access to that, and that's another barrier that's in place. And just focused on what Sarah mentioned before, there's still a no DSS attitude and discriminatory practices that are happening, whilst unlawful in terms of no DSS, it's still prevalent and it's still there. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we put in place, or some of the support that we offer and the strategies that we've implemented. So we, like Sam earlier on, and working up in Edinburgh, Merseyside, we have a landlord liaison officer who is the designated point of contact with landlords throughout the time of a tenancy. Now, that's not throughout the entirety of the tenancy, but it will be until tenant has settled into the property. If there's no issues, then obviously there's no need to continue that work, but we can still always be a point of contact for the landlord going forward. We have an initial contact housing procurement volunteer who works closely with the landlord liaison officer. And when we were setting the project up, the landlord liaison officer was spending an awful lot of time doing effectively cold calling to landlords to sell the service and to try and get more and more landlords on board, and not getting very far really. Sometimes there was a bit of a difficulty getting some landlords engaged, and a huge amount of time and resource going into that to be told no. And when we were getting the successful relationships with landlords, it's difficult then to continue that relationship when a lot of your time is still then trying to build new relationships as well. So a response to that was to train a volunteer to effectively do a lot of that cold calling work, build up those some initial relationships for those landlords that may be interested or like the sound of it or wanted further information. And then we could send that hot link over to the landlord liaison officer to then continue building that relationship and doing some of the more practical work. During the pandemic, Liverpool local authority offered and commissioned Crisis to administer a private rented sector grant, which was initially for everyone in. And during the pandemic, Liverpool local authority placed everybody into emergency accommodation who was rough sleeping or who was homeless, and all property pool was suspended, and all of the social landlords in the area all came together to pool all of their available properties, and we were matching prospective tenants with available properties. But when that grant was made available for us for personalised for private rented sector, it was made available for only the people who were placed into emergency accommodation. And because the offer of social housing was there for a lot of those people, or for all of those people who were tenancy ready, they were choosing the social option more so than the private rented sector option. So when we knew that the Everybody In panel and the homelessness reduction panel was coming to an end, we requested to the local authority if we could repurpose that personalisation grant and that private rented sector grant to support anybody into private rented, so anybody who was facing homelessness into the private rented sector. And so now we're administering that grant, and that's to support with anything that could help somebody access a private rented tenancy in any kind of financial means, which could be rent advance deposits or things such as furniture or even ID, depends on the needs of the individual. We are offering ongoing support for landlords and tenants, and we have landlord networking events as well that we put on for people. Can I go on to the next slide, please? So some of that support that we offer for landlords, which you mentioned before, was the designated point of contact, which is the landlord liaison officer. So any issues that we may be having with a tenant or with a tenancy, we can have that close contact with the landlord and provide them with support. We provide the tenants with an allocated lead worker and we support with regular home visits to ensure that the tenancy is being maintained, that there's no issues, and that there's a level of security for the landlord that the tenant is being supported. Part of the offer is that we'll do a matching service for the right tenants to the right properties. So it's a very bespoke service to the individual. What we want to do is ensure that we've done an affordability check, that the individual is right for the tenancy, and that the tenancy is right for the individual. We want to help the tenants as well when they move in to their property. So if a person's on universal credit, what we want to do is set up that direct payments direct to the landlord if that's what's needed. Anything that tries to grease the wheels, if you like, with allowing a landlord allowing us access to their properties. We do offer rent in advance and deposits as well, and that'll also include a holding fee. And we can also offer landlord protection insurance too. Next slide. And so for some of the tenants, the support that we offer tenants, so we will offer pre-tenancy suitability assessments. And that is working with the individual to look at, is the property right for them? Is it suitable? Is it sustainable? Is it something that they're going to manage in the long term? What areas do they want to live in? Is it correct to meet their needs, or is it something that is going to fail? If it's something that is going to fail, then we'll have a very or something that's likely to fail for whatever reason, then we'll have a very honest conversation with the individual before we kind of sign them up for a tenancy. If that's the case, then what we want to do is offer the support and training courses for the tenant to understand what their rights and responsibilities are as a tenant, how they can raise any issues and how they can sustain that tenancy. If there's antisocial behaviour in their block, if they're struggling with their rent, if they are going through some sort of crisis, or they're finding that there's some level of social isolation, how they can deal with that, and who they can, what services they can access. As I mentioned before, we can support with rent in advance and deposits and the direct payment setup. But then we'll also do in-tenancy support as well. So when the tenant has moved in, or we've supported them to move into that property, help them with setting up bills, making sure that they have got their council tax set up, their gas and electric, TV license, having an understanding of what the priority bills are and how they go about paying those. But it is very much a bespoke service to the individual, and somebody needs a little bit of extra help doing that, whether that's showing them where the post office is to make that payment, telling them the telephone number, supporting them making those initial calls, then and teaching the individual and coaching that individual so that they can maintain that tenancy themselves and not have a reliance on our service or somebody to do it for them. As was mentioned previously, we'll look at income maximisation and money management, making sure that they're getting access to the right funds if they're on benefits, or support them into employment if that's what the client is looking for. And all of that feeds into the one-to-one coaching and responsive support that we offer. Things like social isolation prevention, which I mentioned before, and which we thought was really, really important. So it's not just supporting somebody into a tenancy and saying, right, there you go, you've got somewhere to live now and off you go. That there's a lot of other support that we want to link people into as well. So do they know where their GP is? Do they know where their local pharmacy is? What kind of interests do they have? Do they play football? Do they know where the local five-a-side pitch is? Do they want to go to the local gym? How can we get them a membership? How can we help them get access to that? And really try and do a holistic level of support. It's not just tenancy support, but actually it's tenant support. And mediation and tenancy breakdown prevention. So again, maintaining contact with the tenant to ensure that or try to prevent as much as we can any issues that may arise before it becomes a problem. But of course, problems will occur, and knowing the right ways in which to deal with those issues. And I think that's it from me. The next slide, I think, is a thank you slide. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks to everyone. If you'd maybe like to come back on screen, That would be super, thanks. Well, that's been really interesting, and we've been having lots of questions and answers actually in the Q&A as we've been going through. So thank you to the panelists who've been responding to people's questions. As we've not got an awful lot of time left in the session, what we'll do is we will summarise those Q&As anonymously after the event, and we'll share them along with the slides to all attendees so that you can see what questions were asked. If there's any additional questions, now's the time, but I do have a few that haven't been answered. So my first question from Sam is, and this is for all of you to give us your thoughts. How can frontline staff find out about landlord forums in their areas? So if anybody would like to chip in with any thoughts on that question.
I mean, I know at the start of Help to Rent, maybe James will correct me, but I think Crisis had put on their own kind of landlord forum to sort of give information to landlords and letting agents and to try and get some buy-in.
Yeah, we've done I think there was quite a lot of work at the beginning in terms of different like events, and I think I'd kind of touched on it in terms of like creating booklets, in terms of visiting letting agents, and then some of it was just around when tenancies were being set up, when we were applying for properties. That's an opportunity immediately to say, this is what we do, this is our service, this is how it can support you in the future. It's not just about this one tenancy, it's about future tenancies as well. So yeah, there was a bit of both, a bit of sort of try to promote what we were doing as widely as possible, just generally, and also kind of working on an ongoing basis to show how the service could work in landlords and letting agents to their benefit, and they would see the results of it. So for example, if we had one or two tenants with a letting agent or a landlord and those tenancies were going really well, they would look at it and they think, well, if another property comes up, we know that we can get in contact with Sam and let them know about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question in full, but a variety of different methods.
That's great. Thanks, James, Vicky. And Con has asked a question about universal credit and the housing element direct payments. It says, how can we ensure that the UC housing element direct payments go to landlords straight away instead of off into the bank accounts of vulnerable clients who might think that it's their money?
Do you want me to answer that one? I mean, the way that we used to approach it, again, usually the kind of initial stage when we're talking to prospective tenants, we would be basically advising them of how direct to landlord payments work and how it could benefit them. And we also had good relationships with the local job centres as well. And basically it was just about making sure that everyone was on board with it before the start of the tenancy. So explaining to the tenant how it benefits them, explaining to the landlord how it's going to work, because if it's a direct to landlord payment, there needs to be communication with the landlord or letting agent before that usually takes effect anyway. So it's just basically about making sure all the parties are in agreement in advance of the start of the tenancy and then making it happen. And that's usually just about making sure you've got that relationship with your local job centre to put it in place and make sure that you've got agreement, consent from the tenant, and the landlord knows what they need to sign and what they need to do next.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's something we really struggled with on the pilot, was making sure that that first payment was in and on time. So, you know, there was a lot of kind of training and awareness raising around how DWP systems work and when the housing costs and everything need to be uploaded so that the payments are going through correctly. But I think trying to get a single point of contact at the DWP helped us hugely, you know, so that when there were these issues and things didn't go as they should have done, having somebody to call, you know, that could look into the account and fix whatever problems were there. So once we had got those single point of contacts on board and working with us, we found that helped massively, you know, because we really struggled with that initially.
Thank you. I'd like to ask myself as well, in terms of the legal support that you might need around running these schemes. Have there been any instances where you've needed legal support for tenants around landlords fulfilling their legal obligations, maintenance, etc.? And whether there are any standards in place, any quality compliance standards to ensure that those landlords are of a suitable standard for the tenants. I'm not sure who I should direct that question to, so
I'll at least take it, because I can say from our side that we've been lucky enough to not have to go down that route and not have any kind of legal issues that we've been facing. Now in Liverpool, it seems to have been disbanded, and it looks like it's coming back again, but there does need to be a landlord license. There's a landlord licensing scheme for private rented landlords in Liverpool, which Liverpool Local Authority runs, which effectively does that vetting process of landlords beforehand. It wasn't the most thorough, and it wasn't always brilliant, but it did give you a somewhat of a safety net in terms of rogue landlords, I would say. And during the pandemic, it looked like they stopped doing that, but it looks like they're bringing it back at the moment. But I think some of it is based on the relationships that we have with the landlords, is that we would often go out around and try and see what the relationship with the landlord could be, what the standard of the properties was like beforehand. And touch wood, we've not had to go down that route yet, but I don't know whether anybody else on the panel has had to and want to chip in on that side.
I think we're quite lucky in Scotland. We've got fairly strong legislation. We also have quite good relationships, and maybe Sam can touch on this as well. And we made a condition of any landlords that took part in our scheme that they needed to be registered, obviously, first of all, with the local authority. They needed to make sure that the safety certificates and energy performance certificates were up to date as well before the tenancy would start. But I don't know if you want to add a bit to that, Sam.
Well, yeah, again, I feel the experience has been good. And generally, just due to the nature of the landlords needing to accept the bond, and, you know, often, personally, I find that the more kind of cutthroat landlords, the scheme doesn't appeal to them. You know, I mean, sometimes you do, I mean, I'm keen to get as much business for us as possible, but the deal has to work for both parties to be viable. And sometimes a landlord isn't suitable for the scheme. But yeah, James is quite right. We make sure that they are registered as landlords. And again, that feeling of me being like an empty homes officer, you know, that can be a supportive role in helping them to register. But we also have a landlord obligation to go through. So, you know, that again is kind of a vetting process. And yeah, we do have links with other legal organisations who also can provide advice to our tenants and to staff as well. So, you know, we do have links with other legal organisations. And the scheme was actually set up by a solicitor, actually, a former colleague. So, you know, she had a very strong legal background. But yeah, we have been quite fortunate, and I think it speaks well to the PRS sector. Actually, I think quite a good representation of them, you know, their conduct of the scheme so far.
Thank you, Sam. So we're getting to the end of the session now, and I just wondered whether the panelists have got any final comments. I think you've all drawn out the importance of partnership working in lots of different aspects of the work that you've been talking about. Is there any? Have you got any closing comments or key advice for frontline workers who are here today who might be working in this area?
I think partnership working, and probably something that I didn't mention in my presentation, but that we very much did from the tenant surveys and from speaking to tenants, was being able to kind of adapt our offering based on feedback, you know. So we had feedback near the beginning that, you know, the stages and the process wasn't clear to people that were going through it. So we developed a kind of flow chart to show people all the stages that they would be going through. So I think, you know, really listening to tenants and potential tenants and responding to what they're saying as well in their feedbacks was hugely important.
My final comment is just, it's really tough out there. So as frontline workers, I guess really make sure that you think about your own well-being and you make sure that you're well supported in what you're doing. I know there's nothing more soul-destroying than phoning up 20 landlords just to be told to go away to all of them when you're trying to house some people, and it can be really hard work. So, and I suppose it does sound depressing, but I'm not sure it's going to get very much easier, particularly in the next 12 months or so. So I guess, yeah, look after yourself. Make sure that you get the support that you need to carry on doing a great job.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. That brings us to the end of our panelists' conversation. We're just going to go to a few final Mentimeter slides. I've just noticed we might have another question here. Just before we end, this is an interesting point from Con regarding the UC47s. He says, Con says, thank you, but UC47s are set up first, and sometimes second payments are still going to the tenant, and they end up in rent arrears almost as soon as they move in and threaten with eviction. And Con wants to know, is there any lobbying happening to centralise this in DWP to ensure that the payments don't go to vulnerable clients? I'm not sure whether that's something anyone can comment on or knows about at this point.
I mean, that was certainly one of the things we fed back to the Scottish Government, you know, through our report to them, and we did a specific paper with case studies on DWP, and that was one of the key things that came up, you know. And I think without having frontline workers actually being there and looking in the UC claims to know what was going on, I think, you know, we would have been in a lot worse of a position. So yeah, we definitely fed that back.
That's great. And I know that the frontline networks in Coventry and in Blackpool, Wire and Fylde have also been involved in consultations with their local areas and feeding into DWP around universal credit payments. So it is something that people are working away on in the background. So if we could please just move to the last couple of slides, and I want to thank everybody very much for a really, really interesting session. Attendees, if you'd like to go to the menti.com website again as before and use the same code, if it's still on that page, you can just refresh and it should come up with this slide for you. And again, we're just going to ask, how effectively do you feel you could support PRS tenants? And we'll share the results of this at the after the event, along with various other resources. You'll also see that Amanda's been sharing, and Sarah and others have been sharing links in the chat. So you might want to make a note of some of that for further information on many of the subjects that we've talked about today. Okay. So just give that a minute. Okay, so everybody looks quite effective, which is good to see. As I said, we can't really do a comparison in real time, but we will send out a comparison just to see whether anyone's feeling differently as a result of what we've learned today. So finally, just to say thank you all for attending. If we could go to the next slide, please, Rachel. It's another Menti. And what action, if any, would you take as a result of attending today's event? And that might be making a referral to one of the organisations that you learned about today, applying the info from today's session to your role working with people, follow up on a new contact, raise a new idea with your team or with your manager or something else. That's great. So it looks like people are taking away some ideas and information to apply in their roles and with their teams. And we'll also send around a feedback questionnaire to attendees, and we'd be really grateful if you'd be able to complete that. It takes about 2 minutes, and the information that you share with us is really, really valuable for helping us to plan future events, identify what people want to hear about, and try and make the most relevant content and resources for frontline workers. So thank you very much for that. That's super. And one last slide, please, Rachel. Thank you. That's the last slide. So thank you very much. And yeah, we will follow up with another survey question and all the information from today's session. So just say thank you very much to our panels, to our panelists, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.